We are not quite ready yet for the live stream. It's still getting set up. All right, go right ahead and get started.
Okay, well, we're still technically at 11:59, so I'll just speak slowly. But I'm Jennifer Summers. I'm going to be moderating today. This is the next talk in the session, the Climate and Charismatic Waterbirds session. And just to let you know, folks, how this is going to work, we have our speaker is going to be talking for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'd like to allow 15 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, half hour she'll be speaking. And so you can put your questions in the Q&A at any time. And if you see a question that you like and would really like to see it answered, feel free to upvote that question, and those will rise up to the top and they will be answered. They will be answered a little bit quicker potentially. And so questions will be right off at the end. But again, please enter your questions in the chat box. I'm sorry, not chat box, in the Q&A, excuse me. And so as of right now, then, I would like to introduce Sadie Odell. And today she is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife biologist at the HORICON Marsh. And she is going to be speaking today about American white pelicans in Wisconsin. Are they here to stay? Thank you, Sadie.
Well, thank you. Thanks for joining me. And before I get started, just a little bit of a quick background on my professional history. I've been with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for over 15 years, and the majority of those years has been at HORICON National Wildlife Refuge. For those of you who don't know, we manage a couple other refuges out of HORICON National Wildlife Refuge. We manage Fox River National Wildlife Refuge, which was established for sandhill cranes in Marquette County. And we also manage Gravel and Green Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which is comprised of 8 islands that stretch in Lake Michigan, that stretch from Door County to the Gardiner Peninsula in Michigan. And then we also manage the Leopold Wetland Management District, which is comprised of 58 waterfowl production areas in 8 counties in southeastern Wisconsin. So I'm the wildlife biologist and I cover all of that land that we manage. And so I get the great fortune of working with a variety of different water birds across the landscape, from waterfowl and black terns and pelicans at HORICON to Caspian terns and herring gulls and pelicans also up at Green Bay National Wildlife Refuge on some of our islands. So with that, I'll jump into my experience and my knowledge about American white pelicans in Wisconsin. For my presentation today, I'll get into a little bit on the identification and life history of pelicans, the status of pelicans in Wisconsin, some regional and continental population dynamics and how that might influence the status of pelicans in Wisconsin. And then I'll get into some factors affecting populations, including some climate change as it relates to climate change in the Midwest and Wisconsin on our national wildlife refuges where we manage pelicans. So you're looking right now at a overview of North America and the range of American white pelicans. You can see the blue, and they overwinter in our Gulf Coast states and in the southern part of California. They breed primarily in the western and central Canadian provinces. That's the orange on the map. There's over 130,000 breeding pelicans in North America. And you'll notice that we're talking about breeding pelicans in Wisconsin, and you'll notice that the map does not include breeding pelicans in Wisconsin. And we'll get into that a little bit more into my presentation. Just generally speaking, it's because that they're fairly new arrivals to Wisconsin, breeding and nesting here only within the past 2 decades. So very interesting and exciting story to tell when it comes to pelicans in Wisconsin. Some basic identification, you can see that they are a very large white bird. The most distinguishing characteristic when you see them is the black primaries. They have the second longest wingspan in North America, only behind the California condor. Their wingspan is between 9 and 12 feet, quite big. An enormous bill with the pouch that you typically think of when you think of a pelican. They have webbed feet, and they have a total palmate foot. So I threw that in there just to maybe give some people a new word to think about. Totopalmate, when it comes to webbed feet in water birds, means that all 4 toes are connected by webbing. Species like mallards and other waterfowl ducks, they only have the 3 middle toes connected. So the totopalmate foot is something unique to pelicans and birds such as like the other boobies and stuff like that. They have a totally palmate foot. They fly with their head withdrawn and their legs tucked. And depending on where you are in the state, you may end up seeing a similar bird that has a large white bird with black primaries, and that's the whooping crane. So if you're on a place like HORICON Marsh, where we have both species, from a distance, you might see a large white bird with black primaries and think, oh my gosh, is that a whooping crane? When it could in fact be pelicans. But if you're close enough, you're definitely going to be able to see those distinguishing characteristics closer and be able to pick out a pelican. They frequent lakes, marshes, and when they're on their wintering grounds, they are using coastal bays and estuaries. And they breed in fresh water and mostly inland, and they nest on isolated islands. They like to feed in shallow lakes, rivers, and marshes. And they often travel in large flocks, soaring using thermals. So I think a spectacular sight is to look up and see large groups of pelicans soaring and using those thermals, and they're kind of synchronous in their flying habits. And it's really quite the sight to see when you see large groups gathering, especially as they are getting ready to migrate or moving from their breeding grounds to their feeding grounds during the day. We'll see them moving between HORICON Marsh and the river channel on the Rock River during the day, during the breeding season. So I always enjoy it when they're here for the summer. They're a colonial nesting water bird, which means they nest in large numbers, sometimes over 1,000 birds in one place. And they commonly nest with double-crested cormorants and other colonial nesting birds in the state, like herring gulls up on our refuge islands in Lake Michigan. Their diet, they prey mostly on rough fish or small schooling fish, very opportunistic and feeding changes with water levels and prey abundance. At HORICON Refuge, they eat a lot of carp and bullheads, and we're kind of thankful that they're eating a lot of our invasive carp on the refuge. They also can eat salamander and crayfish depending on where they are in the landscape. They're part of their diet out in some of the refuges in the Great Plains. They're coordinated in swimming groups, and they're well known for being a cooperative feeder and coordinating in these swimming groups and driving fish into shallow waters and capturing them. Very, very efficient at catching fish. Fish are easily caught with their bill, and they do not dive like their cousin, the brown pelican. So they're more of a surface feeding bird. Picture of a breeding adult here. Breeding begins at 3 years of age. They live to be 20 to 30 plus years, a very long-lived bird. Earlier in the breeding season, they get bright bills and bright orange legs, and you can see the white plumes of feathers on the back of their head there. And one of the most unique features about American white pelicans is the laterally flattened horn on the upper mandible of their beak, which is only present during the breeding season. And that actually falls off shortly after chicks the breeding season when nests are nearing the end of breeding. So I think that's a real interesting characteristic and unique characteristic about pelicans. The nests are shallow in depression with a low rim. They're formed by the adult raking gravel and soil and vegetation into nests. It's very, the nest's rim is very poorly defined, which means that if a pelican is spooked from a nest, those eggs can easily be rolled out of the nest. Both males and females build nests. This is a picture of a typical nesting habitat here at HORICON Marsh in nesting colony. They lay 2 eggs per clutch. The first egg is laid within a day of nest completion. The second egg is laid 2 days later, excuse me. Both parents incubate, switching every second day. Incubation is about 30 days. And usually only one chick survives. That's called siblicide, when the older, larger chick can outcompete the smaller bird for food. Something interesting when I've been out doing pelican surveys on the refuge nesting surveys, when the chicks are in the embryos such as this, if they're old enough and they get the temperature change from their parents sitting on the eggs and then moving off, you can actually hear the chicks squawking through the egg, wanting their parents to come back as quick as possible to keep that thermal regulation and nesting going on. So that's kind of an interesting thing too, that is unique to pelicans. Pelican chicks, they're young and totally dependent on parents for food, warmth, and protection. They're born naked and by 10 days are covered in down, and they remain in the nest for 2 to 3 weeks. And after that, they start to gather in groups of young, which we call creches or pods. They're able to swim within 26 days and fly by 7 to 10 weeks. Nearly half the population nests in the northern plains. In the eastern US, they breed predominantly in the Great Plains in winter along the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast. Chase Lake National Wildlife Refuge is home to one of the largest pelican colonies. In the year 2000, there was over 35,000 breeding pelicans at Chase Lake. So now we'll get into a little bit more of the history of pelicans in Wisconsin. Pelicans in Wisconsin have been present. The literature suggests that they've been present as migrants for centuries. And between 1939 and 1989, there were only 1 to 4 reports of sightings occurring in about 8 in every 10 years. So very infrequent sightings. In 1991, still, there was only 2 eBird observations. And by 2012, the observation increased to 640 sightings at 238 sites in 36 counties. Here's a map showing the common nesting areas in Wisconsin. They increased in numbers, breeding in upper Midwest and Minnesota, and both Minnesota and Wisconsin. The first known pelican nest in Wisconsin was on Cat Island, and that's in Green Bay, and that was in 1994. And now pelicans nest in unprecedented numbers within a relatively short time frame. And those 2 main regions are Green Bay and then eastern Wisconsin. They nest on isolated islands, dredge spoil banks, dikes, and even on flattened cattail mats at HORICON. They like to nest in areas that have available abundant food resources near the colony site, and they can forage several hundred kilometers from a colony site and still breed successfully. They're highly adaptable to changing habitat conditions. And we found that out at HORICON when some of our spoil or nesting sites are unavailable. They will, like I said, go and flatten down cattail mats and use those to nest in. So just to look at, you can kind of get a gauge how quick the increase in nesting pelicans were in Wisconsin. There was a large initial increase, apparently due from immigration from outside of Wisconsin, so likely from the northern Great Plains and their typical breeding grounds, which we saw in an earlier slide. This was followed by a relatively stable population increase. In Green Bay, there was the small number in the mid 1990s and a sudden jump in 1996, followed by a real steady increase. If you look at hopefully you can see those numbers okay. On HORICON National Wildlife Refuge, that was the first nesting site in eastern Wisconsin in 1990, and they showed up in 1999. From 2005 to 2013, the state's pelican population increased 275% to over 4,000 nesting pairs at 8 colony sites. If you look across the top, some of those sites where they nest are Cat Island, Lone Tree Island, which is in the vicinity of Cat Island in Green Bay. And then there's Hat Island, which is a little bit further up to the north, up towards Door County off of Egg Harbor. The eastern Wisconsin region would include HORICON National Wildlife Refuge, Lake Butimore, Beaver Dam Lake, Lake Puckaway, and then also Lake Winnebago. If you kind of look at the years from when pelicans started nesting at HORICON National Wildlife Refuge, you can see their first year. I don't think there were surveys. This is a little bit before my time done during this time period, but then they really show an increase in 2003 and 2004. Then you can see that they kind of decline again here. And if you look at that decline, I just wanted to point out that that's when the numbers really increase on Lake Butimore and Winnebago. So it's likely that the pelicans, if they don't have nesting habitat available at a place like HORICON, they can easily shift and move to Butimore or Winnebago. And in fact, in recent years, we did not have nesting habitat available due to high water at HORICON. There was a large increase in birds in the Winnebago pool and also up on some of the Green Bay Islands as well. Just to get into a little bit more on pelicans at HORICON Refuge, I know this graph is probably a little bit harder to see, but this just kind of shows how populations of pelicans on the refuge fluctuate with water levels and available nest sites. So in those years when we have high waters and nest sites are limited, that's when we typically don't see a lot of pelicans nestings. However, they will be there feeding. Like I said, they do travel quite far from their breeding grounds to feed. So if they're nesting up on Lake Butimore or Winnebago in any particular year, they still may be down at HORICON feeding. There's some competition for nesting space at HORICON. We really don't see a lot of nesting space. They nest on old spoil piles, and so there's some competition with other nesting birds like double-crested cormorants at HORICON. The most nests fledged occurred in 2006, and those were at 6 nesting sites across the refuge. And we fledged over 1,400 young that year. In recent years, like I said, they've expanded even more up into Door County, and we see them nesting in small numbers on some of our colonial nesting waterbird islands like Spider and Pilot, which have large double-crested cormorant populations on them for many years. And now we're starting to see some of the pelicans move on to those islands as well. So why the increase in breeding pelicans in Wisconsin? We need to look at some regional and continental population dynamics to get some of those answers. The continental population was considered threatened until the 1960s by habitat loss and changing water levels, and to some extent some chemical contaminants like DDT. There was some western habitat loss due to agricultural diversions, and we suspect that some of those pelican populations started shifting eastward. That population has recovered and continues to increase continentally at a rate of almost 3% annually. We suspect that some of the large numbers at HORICON may have resulted from an influx of pelicans from Minnesota and North Dakota. In the years 2002 and 2003, there was some high chick mortality and at some of those typical breeding sites in the Great Plains, and in particular Chase Lake National Wildlife Refuge. They sent in some of those birds for testing for necropsy at the Wildlife Health Center there in Madison, and a lot of those chicks came back as having died from West Nile virus. And we do know now that pelicans are very susceptible to West Nile virus. And in 2004 at Chase Lake, they completely abandoned up to 30,000 birds over a 2-week period. They suspect some of that abandonment was due to weather-related events, the birds nesting earlier in the season, and got some severe weather events and caused those birds to pack up and leave. And that date coincides with some of those large increases, especially at HORICON. And then there is some band recoveries. They've done a lot of banding out at Chase Lake. I think they've banded over 30,000 birds out at that National Wildlife Refuge. And some of those bands do pop up here from band recoveries in Wisconsin. So that does support that breeding birds in Wisconsin have originated from the Dakotas and Minnesota. So to summarize why they are here in Wisconsin, it's apparently because we are the beneficiary of an eastward continental range expansion. And then after that initial establishment from the range expansion, they found a place that there was suitable habitat and available habitat with abundant prey and fish populations. They had a high rate of recruitment from these growing colonies early in the establishment phase in the 2005, 2004 time period. You can see here, this is a picture of a nest site at HORICON where they're bringing back carp. I think this carp is probably a little too large for a chick to eat, but you can kind of see that they have plenty of fish available at HORICON National Wildlife Refuge. Some threats to pelican populations. So a lot of the threat comes from habitat loss and degradation. There's still some shooting that occurs, especially down on their wintering grounds at some of the aquacultural facilities, catfish facilities. There's still a fair amount of both authorized and unauthorized shooting that happens down there. Predation is also a concern. At a site like HORICON, we have seen entire colonies abandon nesting sites due to likely coyote or raccoon or fox. They are also predated by gulls and owls and eagles, all of which we do have at HORICON. They have also environmental contaminants. There's new and emerging contaminants, mercury, that may still impact populations of pelicans. There's issues such as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the soap agents that they use for oil dispersal. This may also have some impact on populations to this day. Disease is also a concern. There's, like I said before, pelicans are very susceptible to West Nile virus. They are susceptible to botulism type E, that's a fish-eating disease in avian disease, cholera, and also Newcastle disease. I have had to, I think at HORICON and up on our islands, we've had to send in sick birds, and I believe I have gotten diagnosis back on both West Nile and Newcastle's and botulism type E for pelicans that we've found sick and dead on some of our refuge lands. They're very, very sensitive to human activity. So especially during their early incubation and courtship. So it's very important that we aren't out disturbing chicks and eggs during this critical nesting time. They're also very susceptible to gull predation. So if a human or a predator walks into these nesting sites, these nesting islands, that could cause the adults to abandon and leaving chicks and eggs exposed to the elements and also exposed to predation such as gulls. So they're very sensitive to motorboats approaching, low-flying airplanes, even kayaks. Very, very sensitive to disturbance. Some of the populations in the state are vulnerable to disturbance due to other efforts to control double-crested cormorants in the state. So there's several sites, like I mentioned, where pelicans co-nest with double-crested cormorants, and there are efforts to reduce double-crested cormorant populations in the state. So those efforts, egg oiling, shooting on sites where pelicans nest may contribute to some disturbance to pelicans in the state. I just wanted to cover a little bit of climate change predictions and how climate change may impact pelicans. When we talk about climate change in the Midwest, and there's two scenarios that they anticipate, one being a wet scenario, and that wet scenario is similar to what we're seeing in recent years, but worse. Winters are normal, but with more possibilities for rain on frozen ground. Springs are wetter with earlier springs. Summers are a bit wetter with more hot days, and falls are a lot wetter and warmer. These are the types of weather patterns that we are already seeing and having to deal with at HORICON, and being in a highly manipulated environment where where we get a 24-hour rainfall and have 2 inches, and that time period can have devastating effects on pelicans nesting on the refuge. So those intense rain events can bounce nests very quickly, and we're unable to move that amount of water off the refuge because of just downstream dam operations and other people who are dealing with flooding in the watershed. So it's a delicate balance that we try to work with on the refuge. But so some other potential impacts with the wet scenario is that nesting phenology changes. We talked a little bit about out in Chase Island, or Chase Refuge and the Great Plains. Their nesting phenology, they've done some study on why those pelicans abandoned those nest sites, and they think maybe some of that has to do with nesting phenology changes, and that they initiated nesting almost 16 days earlier than they had historically, and that's leaving those colonies a little more vulnerable to some cold weather events in the early spring and breeding time frame. and like that's leading to more chick mortality and could influence nesting populations of pelicans on here at HORICON as well. The dry scenario is winters with a little same normal precipitation, but more possibilities for rain events on that frozen ground. Springs are a bit wetter and much earlier. And then the difference between the wet scenario is that summers become very dry and much more hot days. And falls are a little bit normal presentation, but much warmer temps. So we're looking at some similar impacts due to the dry scenario, the nesting phenology changes, and something that may impact if we go into longer drought periods of time with climate change is that the pelicans do like to require those isolated nesting islands, and those persistent dry conditions may create land bridges to those nesting islands with those, and that may allow predators to reach those nesting islands a little bit easier. Those hot summers typically can produce conditions that are favorable to disease outbreaks, especially at HORICON National Wildlife Refuge. If we get mud flats in that heat in the hottest summer, we can really start to see botulism becoming an issue at HORICON and some of those other sites too up in Green Bay on those islands. I know some of the warmer waters and conditions may contribute to botulism type E, which is more of the botulism that is spread with fish-eating birds up in those areas. So something that may increase due to the dry scenario when we think about climate change and how they may impact pelican populations in the state. So that leads me to the question, are pelicans here to stay in Wisconsin? They are good dispersers, and so they're known to be wander, and sometimes wandering 500 miles is not unusual. So they may be better adapted to climate change, just that their ability to move at quite a distance. And as long as they have places to nest and fish to eat, I think they will likely stay here in Wisconsin. But those extreme weather events that are correlated with climate change do have the potential to wipe out entire bird colonies, which could have a big impact on a long-lived species such as a pelican. So I think you could look at it in two ways, that they're adapted, but you could also look at it that one of those extreme events could have a severe impact on the pelican population. In recent years, they are expanding their range even further. They've been spotted in Lake Superior in 2020 and nesting in Michigan, and also pushing eastward into the Great Lakes. There's nesting documentation of them in Lake Erie, and there's a lot of similar nesting islands like we have in Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. So like I said, as long as they have places to nest and fish to eat, they seem to be adaptable and moving and expanding their range even further east. But like I talked about, they are extremely sensitive to human disturbance, and it may be becoming more and more difficult to find breeding sites that don't have human disturbance as you look across the landscape. So what can we do to protect pelicans? We can support climate forward initiatives. We can listen to the birds. The saying is that they are the canary in the coal mine. So when we have these events, and we should be listening to them and learning. We should be protecting all the island sites that are used for nesting and extended roosting during the breeding sites. So these newer islands that they've expanded to in Lake Michigan on the refuge and others in that area, we should be looking to continue to protect and protect new sites as well. Protecting wetland habitat along their migration corridors, and preventing all human access to the islands used by pelicans would be important, and just getting the word out about pelicans and how sensitive they are, and respecting that, I think, is a good thing to do. So in summary, you know, as it has in the past, will pelicans remain in Wisconsin? We'll have a lot to do. A lot will be dependent on human behavior. So with that, I will open it up to questions. And before I do, I'll just say that this picture I put in at the end here is not, most of my pictures were heavy on the breeding side of things, because those were mine or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service photos. This picture is actually from Sanibel Island on the wintering grounds, and so you can see they look a little different here without being in their breeding plumage, but it gives hope for more warmer weather. And they should be returning here soon to Wisconsin, looking at the warm weather that we do have outside. So. I'll open up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Sadie. We got a couple coming in. So there was a question that starts out with, they're asking about kind of the nesting activity and like where they're nesting. So asking, how about Mississippi Valley? It wasn't shown on your map of nest sites, but the question writer is saying they've observed and photographed a large group at the town park in Stockholm, Wisconsin, and have seen them elsewhere on Lake Pepin.
Yes, I do think that there is definitely sightings in the Mississippi Valley. I'm not positive on nest sites that way, but like I said, they do travel quite a distance, and will travel to feed. So I would suspect that they are nesting somewhere in that vicinity, but they are, like I said, willing to travel. So they are expanding their range, and it would not. There's definitely sightings in that Mississippi River area. So, and I think there's potential for nesting sites over there as well.
Okay, thank you. And then another person writes, unfortunately, there were numerous pelicans stuck here in Green Bay over the winter due to injury. It seems like the local officials didn't know what to do with them, so they suffered. Are these kinds of situations simply survival of the fittest, or should these birds have been saved?
So we've had a few injured pelicans and pelicans that we've had to deal with here at the refuge, and there are facilities that will take pelicans and try to rehab them and release them back on site. There's the Humane Society in Dane County has taken a few of our pelicans. So I think there are potential and there are facilities to work with landowners and agencies if there are issues with pelicans. You know, sometimes there are birds that linger here at HORICON National Wildlife Refuge that maybe it is survival. They just aren't going to make that migration because they have just something isn't wrong with them, and there are unfortunately some of those situations that we do run into. So part of nature, it's not always a easy thing to witness or see, but yeah, some of those breeding birds just weak and won't make it on their first migration.
Okay, so are there overcrowding issues at nest sites due to pelicans that negatively impact other colonial nesting species such as Caspian terns, night herons, etc.?
You know, I have not run into that on any of my sites. The likely transition is that they are getting out competed by a species like a double-crested cormorant. But these colonial nesting islands are very, very dynamic. So their species can change over time. Some of our sites up in the islands on Lake Michigan started as herons and black-crowned night herons breeding, and through their actions of nesting and their droppings, they killed the overstory. Once the overstory declined, that brought in more of the double-crested cormorants, and then that forest and what was remaining continued to decline rapidly with cormorants nesting on the islands, and then that habitat which is more favorable to open ground and no overstory of trees, makes nesting habitat favorable for other species like pelicans and Caspian terns. What I've seen is the different species nesting on these islands, they have their areas, and they defend their areas, and they co-nest pretty good together. And in fact, one of our islands up in Green Bay has a large Caspian tern nest, a well-established Caspian tern nesting colony, which I go out and monitor. And I know for a fact those Caspian terns would never allow a American pelican to set up shop. They're very territorial if they have high site fidelity to those nesting sites. If they're well established, they'll be there and they'll defend their territory, and these other birds will seek out other areas on those nesting islands or islands in the vicinity where they can find their piece of land. But they do co-nest together, but they are also territorial, and so very interesting places to witness and see these colonial nesting birds. They're it's like being on National Geographic. I always say when I get the chance to get out to these, because it's something that not everybody really gets to witness. And I'm sure not everybody would like to witness the smell that I do smell when I'm out on these colonial nesting islands with thousands of nesting birds, and they're sticking tight to these nest sites for 3 months of the summer. They can be pretty smelly.
So we do have a couple more minutes yet. We don't have any more questions at the moment, but if you have any more questions, folks, please feel free to answer or put them in the Q&A. But if I may be so bold, I actually have a question, since there aren't any others at the moment. I know you mentioned that pelicans are doing a pretty good job of taking care of some of the Asian carp, and they're definitely eating fish. And I know that cormorants, fishermen sometimes tend to have an issue with cormorants for eating sport fish. Are we finding that there's kind of a similar reaction to pelicans, or do we know, are pelicans impacting fisheries at all, or has there been any conversations about that?
Yes, there are conversations about that. They do eat fish. They're very opportunistic eating, and so their diet really depends on what's available at that time frame. What they've done studies in particular areas, and sometimes they're eating invasive species like gobies and alewives, but there are certain instances where the pelicans or a species like a double-crested cormorant may impact a fisheries locally, and there are ways that we can alleviate those concerns. But for the most part, they're very opportunistic, and they're eating fish that's available to them at various times, and it can locally affect fish populations, but it's very localized. And so when you think about it on a grand scale of things, you really need to be looking at very site-specific fisheries impacts near these large breeding colony sites to understand and answer those questions a little bit better. It's kind of a hard to place and say, yes, they're impacting fisheries when it's very, very localized where they could have some impact. But for the most part, for me, I'm very happy because they're eating invasive species here at HORICON.
Absolutely. We have one more minute and one more question. She says, I'm looking forward to getting back to Plum Island this summer. Are there any pelicans nesting on those islands around Washington Island?
Yes, we have had pelicans nesting at Pilot Island in recent years, and also down at Spider Island. They're in lower numbers right now, but they were nesting in large numbers at Hat Island, which is a little bit further down the coast, and they've since not been nesting there. And there's also a large nesting colony right across Michigan waters in between that Grand Traverse chain of American pelicans. So I think there's potential for nesting pelicans and more on our refuge islands if the habitat is right for them. And like I said, they've been showing up in recent years in small numbers. So there's definitely some potential to see more pelicans nesting up in that area.
Excellent. Well, that takes us to 12:45. So I'd like to thank you again, Sadie, for joining us. And thank you to everybody who attended this session. And please enjoy the rest of the conference, and be sure to check out our exhibitors. And you can there's some folks in there that may be able to answer any wildlife questions. And you can also contact Sadie through her. You go to the speaker page and you can find her on there and send her a message if you have any additional questions. But otherwise, I would like to say thank you very much.